hello to the viewers at home. Hello to the viewers in this room. So it's my pleasure for this summary seminar to introduce Clara Grazian. She joined the school just earlier this year as a new statistician, and she will tell us what she and her work are all about. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. So as Stefan said, I'm going to introduce some of my work and more of the topic in general of clustering. So part of my research is based on clustering analysis, which is the idea of finding homogeneous group in a population. So I'll give a brief introduction and I'll try to see how to estimate groups in a population. Okay, so it's called, like, clustering is comes also as unsupervised learning, mostly in machine learning. So it's one of those things that is known in a way in statistics and in another in machine learning. So the idea is that we have some data, but we don't have labels of the data, but they can actually be split into groups. And we can detect some patterns in the data. So if we knew that there are 3 populations here, one blue, one green, and one red, then we would be able to split the groups perfectly, but we don't know that. We assume that we don't know that. Usually it's an important first step in any analysis. Sometimes it's called like it's part of the exploratory analysis. But it's pretty important because a lot of subsequent analysis are based on the finding of clusters in a population. There are 2 main, so there are, again, it's difficult to find clusters of algorithms in clustering. And this is part of the problem. So I used the definition here, but there are many other types of splitting algorithms. One is finding partitions in the observations, and this is what usually k-means and mixture models do. Another type of algorithms is hierarchical. So it starts with one cluster and it split observations until you get like n clusters, if n is then sample size, or the other way around, we start with n cluster and merge observations into groups who have just one cluster. So there are different types of algorithms, but again, so I think when I was preparing the slides, I thought about this, and it was actually, so there are many ways to define groups of algorithms in clustering, and the main problem is that there is no clear definition of a group. So a group may be different or differently defined depending on the analysis. This is a bit of a problem in the experiment. But it's like part of my research is based on genomics. So it's an area that I know a bit better, but you can apply similar techniques in many, many areas of science. So for example, what you have here is you have observations. These are tissues, and you're trying to relate them and to make them clusters, which are on the diagonal. And you can see that these are probabilities to belong to each cluster. There are some clusters that are much more likely to be clustered, items that are much more likely to be clustered together. And there are some clusters which are, let's say, less homogeneous. So the probability to cluster observations together is less than 1 or like smaller. And this is a sort of a good example, but there are examples which are much more uncertain. And again, in this case, we are finding 4 clusters. But again, like this is a sort of small cluster. It contains 2 observations. And the question may be, does it make sense to consider that separate than other clusters or not? So for example, this cluster here is much more it's much more sure. Like these items here are much more less sure to be clustered together. Maybe they could be clustered with these ones. So all this talk is about how to find the correct number of clusters and then an optimal partition. I just introduced the k-means algorithm for those of you who are not familiar with that, just to have an example of some types of non-statistical algorithms. So the k-means initialize the problem by fixing number of points, like a number of clusters, and then finds distancing among observations. So that, for example, this point here is clustered together with this observation because it's closer than observations here. And so they found, like, k-means find the best partition depending on some type of distances. But again, just looking at this plot, you would have probably find 5 clusters. But it's a bit unclear how to cluster these observations here, how to allocate them. Like the fact that we are splitting observations like this mostly depend on the type of distance that we are choosing for our algorithm. So a lot of things depending, like a lot of the final results depend on the type of distance that you're choosing. And this can be seen like then in some weird type of clustering where depending on, so like clustering is a high dimensional problem because the number of partitions that we may have is extremely large, and I'll discuss that in a moment. But then if you look at different dimensions of these partitions, then some type of clustering, some types of distances using k-means and other algorithms may favor some types of distances among observations, and some others may favor other distances. And so sometimes you end up with this type of clustering that if you look at the observation in some dimensions, actually there is no separation among the observation. So another type of algorithms that is used is based on mixture models, and it's what is usually called model-based clustering. So a mixture model is convex combinations of distributions and PDFs, where we have the usual constraint on the probabilities of allocations that have to be larger than 0 and sum to 1 or to a constant. The distribution for each component or cluster may be any probability distribution, but usually they come from the same class. These are much more general than clustering because they're used also for density estimation to create to generate PDFs or probability density functions which are far from standard distributions. So they could be multimodal, but also kurtotic or asymmetric. But in some cases, for example, if I look at this, so these are all examples of mixture models, or if I look at this black one or the blue one, you can think of each mode to be associated with a cluster. And the idea is how to allocate each observation to each particular cluster. The main advantage of this type of modeling and type of clustering is that the allocation is probabilistic. So you have a probability to allocate each observation to each cluster, and you may make a decision on how to allocate that depending on this probability. So I'm gonna perform clustering according to a Bayesian, in a Bayesian way. So Bayesian analysis is based on the Bayes theorem, which is one of the main results in probability. So the Bayes theorem per se, in the way that it was defined, is a probabilistic result for events, at least the first definition. And it relates, so it gives probability of causes after having observed an effect. So supposing that we observe an effect and we want to compute the probabilities of each possible cause, where causes are mutually exclusive, then we can use the Bayes theorem to compute this probability. But there is an extension to that for random variables, where The idea is to derive a posterior distribution for a random variable, depending on what is called the likelihood of the observations and a prior distributions. So we define a prior distribution for a certain variable. We combine that with what we observe, and then we derive a posterior distribution. This definition is pretty old for random variables. It's a bit more recent for parameters, because the main idea of Bayesian inference is that parameters can be considered random variables, and so we can define a prior distribution on the parameters of the model, combine that with the likelihood of what we observe, and then derive the posterior distribution. And then any type of analysis is based on the description of the posterior distribution. So PDF and PMF are probability density function, probability mass function, because it can be so in the way it's stated here, it's for continuous random variables, but it can be stated for discrete random variables as well. So one thing in Bayesian inference is an essential step in Bayesian inference is to define this prior distribution, and it's essential. So there is a lot of research in how to define these prior distributions for different problems. In particular, when the problem is complicated, it may be difficult. So somehow it is important to reduce the effect of this prior distribution on the definition of the posterior distribution. So to reduce the amount of information that we give a priori, so that what we observe is not overwhelmed by that. And one possible solution is to use what is called usually improper priors. So an improper prior is a distribution which doesn't integrate to one. So it's not really a distribution. And given that it's not a distribution, you can't really apply the Bayes theorem for densities because it's not a density. However, they're usually used in the setting, they're usually used because by combining these prior distributions with a likelihood or a density of the observations, this F here, you may obtain a posterior distribution which is proper. So it's actually a density or a PMF. And the reason to use them, so one of the reasons to use that is that they can be seen as limit, often as limit of proper distributions. So for example, if I use a normal prior with an increasing variance, I obtain like normal distributions which are flatter and flatter. And so you can assume that the variance goes to infinity, and that is an improper prior. But of course, to use improper priors, you have to check that the posterior distribution is actually proper. So it's a density or mass function. In the case, I'm saying this because in the case of mixture models, improper priors are difficult to use, and in most cases they lead to improper posterior distributions. The reason behind this is that if you combine, so let's suppose that we are using independent priors for the parameter theta of this model. The weights are defined on a simplex, so you can imagine a proper prior for them. So let's suppose that we are just using independent improper priors for the parameters of the component distributions. Then a mixture model can be seen as an allocation model, as I said before. So you can think, but like it's impossible that you don't allocate any observation to a particular component. In that case, the posterior distribution of that particular component or the parameters of that particular component will only depend on the prior distribution. And so if the prior is improper, then the posterior will be improper. So this is just an example, a simple example, but there are many more cases showing that using improper prior distribution in this setting leads to improper posterior distributions. There are some results to use like less informative prior distributions, but I'm going to focus specifically on the problem of partitioning, so allocating observations to each cluster. So the idea of mixture models is that there is actually a prior distribution or a model defined on the partition rho n. But what you actually do is just defining a model for the observations and then some type of prior for the parameters of this model. And then this induces a model or a distribution on the partition as well. And so you study the effect of implying this type of model into the partition. The idea is that we assume that each observation has its own, there are extensions for dependent observation, but in this moment, I just consider independent observations. So we assume that each of that depend on a specific model, depending on some parameters. The parameters have their own prior, but then the prior is discrete, so that there are ties among the parameters. And this means that if two observations have the same, are associated with the same component, with the same parameters, it means that they are clustered together. And so you can relate, so you can have like a variable depending, giving you the allocation of each observation I, which is equal to a particular cluster. And this means that that particular observation, the parameter of that particular observation is equal to one of the possible unique models, values generating from the discrete distribution. So this is what is called an induced random partition model, because you model the observations to then derive a model for the partition. So I said most of this, but just I just want to say that modeling the partition is not easy. And one of the reasons for this is that the number of the set of all the partitions is the size of the set of all partitions is particularly big, because it's defined by the Bell number, the nth Bell number, where n is the sample size. And so depending on the sample size, this number may be, so the size may be extremely large. And so it's difficult to investigate all the space of the possible partitions, and so deriving some estimation. So the shape of the partition model induced by a finite mixture model, or like in general a mixture model, has this shape here. So as I said before, if you assume that the observations follow like a particular model, and then you have parameters of this model that follow a prior distribution, and you use a Dirichlet prior for the weights, which is like a distribution defined on the simplex, so it makes sense. And you are completely free in choosing the parameters of this Dirichlet distribution. The induced partition model is this one. So it has a part depending on the prior for the number of clusters, and a part depending on the parameters of the weights. So this gives an idea that the partition and the estimated partition may depend on both the prior distribution that you define on the weights and the prior distribution you define on the number of clusters. And I'm going to discuss both, like solutions to both, like possible solutions to both problems. Yeah. So the prior for the number of clusters and the prior for the weights, something that is chosen by the experimenter. And this induces a prior that has this form here on the partition. Otherwise, and it's another like line of research, you can directly define a prior distribution on the partition itself. But the problem, so in both cases, as I said, the set, so the size of the set of all partitions is very large. So you have to define, you can define a uniform distribution for all the partitions. So every possible partition has the same probability, but it's not extremely helpful in finding the right one. So this is a problem which is not extremely important. So having observation is not extremely informative on the partition. So you have to give some insight with the prior, like it's a possible solution is with a prior. And the fact is that like it's very likely that you need an algorithm to estimate. And if you have a prior that is the same everywhere, like this is a space that you can't investigate with an algorithm. So you have to find ways to investigate just a part of that and making conclusions. So you can define a prior distribution on the set of partitions, but there are other assumptions you have to make. So for example, there are some what is called product partition models where the prior distribution has the form of a product, or you may do an assumption. Another one I know is that you may make assumptions on how many small clusters you have. So you have to make some assumptions on the partition. While if you model the observations, you have to say you're making assumptions anyway, but sometimes it comes more natural. But it has an effect, and I'll talk about that. So both cases, you have to make some assumptions on the partitions or the type of partitions. I'm going to give some example on a data set, trying to be quick, which is extremely famous in clustering, which is the Galaxy dataset. Well, it's known as a Galaxy dataset. Usually this is an example where statisticians use it because it's famous. But I think the reason of this dataset, or the question behind this dataset, was forgotten, because the idea was that at one point there was the hypothesis that there are 3 stellar populations before it was thought that there were just 2. And so there were like some data were collected to investigate the possibility that there was a 3rd stellar population. Not too much in astrophysics, so I don't know much of this, much more than this. But the idea is that the question behind that was there are 2 or 3 stellar populations, and the one that is mostly used is only the univariate one, considering the velocities. So this is an histogram of this data. And there are many papers about this, but the fact is that the number of clusters estimated is between 2 and 15. So if you remember the question, 15 seems a bit high. So one approach is to fix the number of clusters to a large value and use some inference to estimate some of the weights to be different from 0 and some of the weights to be equal to 0. This is the case that is called overfitted mixture. So the idea is that inference will inform you of how many informative components are in the model, in the data, by setting some of the weights equal to 0. So in the estimation procedure, some of the weights will be set equal to 0. And I did some work in this area by proposing what is called a Jeffreys prior. So the Jeffreys prior is a way to define a prior distribution, which is usually not a prior distribution. So many times it's improper, but it's an automatic way to define it as the determinant, the square root of the determinant of the Fisher information matrix of the model. So the Fisher information matrix gives you information on how informative the observations are for the parameters of the model. So the idea is that you have a prior distribution that follows the model, and it increases the chance to be able to to follow the likelihood function. So if I use the Jeffreys prior for all the parameter of location scale mixture model, so for example, a mixture of Gaussian distributions, the posterior distribution is improper. So we can't use this prior distribution. But on the other hand, if we just use this prior distribution for the weights, conditionally on all the other parameters, the shape of this distribution, like I'm showing that in dimension 2, but this is the same in higher dimension. So if we have more clusters, so the shape is this U shape. And the interesting part of this is that it's a prior that is more and more concentrated around 1. The more informative is that particular component, that particular distribution. So for example, if I have, and this is the case, so if I have a mixture between a normal distribution and a student T distribution, which are both symmetric, but the normal distribution is defined on 2 parameters, and the T distribution is a more kurtotic distribution. The normal distribution is more informative in terms of Fisher information. It means that it's easier to define, to estimate the parameters of mean and variance of the normal with respect to the 3 parameters of the student T. And so it means that the prior distribution on the weight of the normal distribution will be more concentrated around 1. And this prior distribution becomes more and more symmetric the more the student T distribution approaches a normal distribution. So it's a way to define an automatic distribution without much input from the experimenter, which naturally favor components which are easy to estimate. And what we obtain on the Galaxy dataset is this. So we have that by imposing 10 clusters at the beginning of the analysis and using a Jeffreys prior for the weights, then 5 components as a weight that was different from 0, and the remaining had a weight concentrated around 0. So we had a full distribution and a density which was larger than 0 only for 5 of the clusters. But as I said before, so this is the case where we are acting on the parameter of the prior for the weights. But there is another case where we actually work on the prior distribution for the number of clusters. So in this case, we can actually define. So in the first case, I fixed the number of clusters and I tried components, and I try to estimate the clusters as a lower number than that. But it's also possible to define a prior on K, and then to derive a posterior distribution on K as well. It is possible to, like in this situation, it is possible to think that the number of clusters is finite. And so define a maximum number of clusters. But there are reasons to use a prior distribution defined on all the space of natural numbers. The idea behind that, so it was proved that it's not consistent to do to use a truncation. So it means that the number of cluster is not well estimated if you do that. But the idea is that the truncation may absorb some of the density. And so that it can create some distortion at the boundary. But on the other hand, it was also proved that if you don't use a prior distribution which is proper, then K can't be estimated. So the posterior distribution for K will be improper. So you need to use a prior distribution that is proper. But another additional problem is that not all the prior distributions are the same. So there are some prior distributions that favor small clusters. One of these is the one given by the Dirichlet process that I'm not really introducing right now, but like it's an extension to consider an infinite number of components and then estimating the number of clusters from that. So this is a prior that tends to favor a lot of many small clusters. So there are many singletons when you estimate the cluster, when you allocate the observations. And if you have many small clusters or many singletons in particular, it may be difficult to then interpret the results because it's unclear if those observations are actually so different from all the others, or it's just something that comes from the inferential procedure. So there are some distributions proposed. There are not many, but there are some distributions proposed in the literature. Like the classic one, which is extremely used in applications, is the one which is uniform for some reason in 030, which has the problem, as I mentioned, that I mentioned before about the truncation. The other one is Poisson, and there are the beta negative binomial, and some authors use it as like in combination with a Dirichlet priors. But what I did with some co-author was to derive like a mathematical procedure to derive it. So the idea, so these are priors, and the idea is that by using the different priors, what you obtain is that the prior on the number of component, which is K, and it's the blue one, may differ from the prior on the number of clusters, which is the red one. So the number of cluster is actually the number of components which are where observations are allocated, which is different from the number of components, which may be fixed a priori as a large number. So they may have a different effect on the posterior inference. So the idea that we had was to use a loss-based prior on K, or approach on defining the prior for K. So the idea is trying to define a loss function on the number of clusters. That means something that, so trying to formalize what we want to avoid in the estimation procedure. And we wanted to use an informative loss and a complexity loss. So we wanted a model that was not too complex if data were not supportive of that. And a model that had a loss of information in the sense that I'm not excluding a possible model with K+1 component if there is evidence that I need one component more than K to describe my data. So for the loss in information, what we used was to define, so the loss of information was defined in terms of the Kullback-Leibler divergence between two different models with two different number of components. But the fact is that, and then given the Kullback-Leibler divergence, we can associate that to a prior, so by just using the self-information, so the exponential of the loss. But the fact is that this loss obtains its minimum at 0, because it's always possible to write a model with k+1 components with respect to 1 with k components by setting either a weight equal to 0, or so the extra weight equal to 0, or some of the parameters equal to the parameters of the components in the k mixture model. So it's not really important in defining the the prior distribution for k. But on the other hand, the complexity loss function is more important. And we can define a complexity loss function just as a linear function of the number of components, which makes sense if the number of parameters is fixed for each component. So if we use components from the same distribution from the same family, they will have the same number of parameters. So we can use a linear function. Now, if I do that, then I can define the prior as I said, the self-information function. So it's the exponential of the loss. And then I could put a prior on this factor c. So I don't have to decide it. And if I choose p defined as the exponential of -c to be a beta distributed random variable, then I can derive an analytic form for the prior on the number of components, which is a beta negative binomial. And then I can decide to choose alpha and beta by default to be equal to 1. And it means that this p is uniform distributed, or I can fix them with some information, previous information that I have on the number of classes, which is what I said here. So if I go back to the Galaxy dataset, you can see that, so the green one is the posterior distribution for the number of clusters obtained with a uniform prior, which is pretty like concentrated around 6, more or less. It means that it assumes 6 clusters. Like our prior is the orange one, which is concentrated around 3, 4, 5. And then the Poisson distribution is very conservative and very informative around 3. So it's more or less a prior which may be, it's in between. It gives a balance between something that is not consistent, which is the red one, sorry, the green one, and something that is very conservative. And more than that, you can define the parameters to include some prior information. This was, so the prior distribution is given here. So these are the prior distributions. So they are actually concentrated around 2, because this is k-1. But nonetheless, the data moved that towards 3. So probably there were three groups in the population. So even if it's a prior, so probably what happens is that it's a conservative prior. So like, as I said, the uniform prior tends to derive more and more clusters as the sample size increases. This is more conservative. So it brings back the posterior distribution towards a lower mode, but there is enough evidence in the data to choose 3 instead of 2. Yeah, so this is the posterior distributions for different priors of the number of clusters. So what you can observe is that there is a strong difference for some of them with respect to the posterior distribution on the number of components. So here you assume that the cluster and the components are different. So you can see that the number of components tend to increase for many. So for both these 2 priors, which is a geometric and a uniform. But the number of clusters, the distribution on the number of clusters tend to be more concentrated around smaller values, except for the beta negative binomial, where there is more concordance between the 2. So I think I'm close to an end. So I think what I wanted to give is that estimating the number of clusters in a population is not an easy task. It may depend. So I think one of the things is that it may depend on the definition of a cluster that you have, or the definition of how homogeneous observations are. And this was the reason why a loss-based approach may be reasonable, because in that way you may introduce through a loss function information on what you believe it's a group or a cluster. But on the other hand, it's pretty evident that so finding a consistent analysis of clustering is still an open problem. And it seems that in a Bayesian setting, a prior distribution may have an important role. So probably the fact is that observations are not extremely informative on how to be allocated. And again, this probably is due to the fact that per se, observations don't have a definition of cluster. So it's also a setting where it's important to reduce the number of necessary assumptions to perform inference, because otherwise these assumptions may have an important role. Everything I said was in univariate setting, but can be easily extended to a multivariate setting. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to get any question.
Because one question would be, is there other ways to maybe learn a prior distribution so the experimenter doesn't have to guess?
So, like I started to work in this on this topic during my PhD, and I was in a very what is called objective group. That means they were using improper priors, which is not necessarily, like, it's not something that all the community agree on. But I think the point is that if you, so both the priors that I showed, this one and the one for the weights, so this one, the idea is to define something that you want on the posterior, and then so it construct a prior like by default. So in this case, it's really everything is defined by default, in the sense that it's defined as the Fisher information, the determinant of the Fisher information, and this, as I said, was good in a sense that it tended to favor some components and not others. And this will bring in, so we proved that, I didn't mention that, but like we proved that like theoretically, the estimation, so the number of components with a non-zero weight will be the right one. It's a way that you define an automatic prior. You try just to define some properties that you want, and then has some good properties. And in this sense, it's even more clear, like in the second example, because the prior is defined on a loss. To me, it makes sense to use a linear loss in the sense that you penalize the number of parameters, which is increasing with the number of components. But you can think about other priors if you want to be more conservative. And then you define a prior distribution with respect to that. And again, like you can choose. So it's interesting that if you choose this, so this loss function and this prior on P, you get a prior distribution which is known in closed form, but you can choose other things and obtaining some other type of distributions. So yeah, I mean, to me, it's a way to reduce the type of assumptions. I mean, a decision theoretic approach, usually it's a way to formalize what you want to penalize. So yeah.
Thank you for your talk. So if I have, let's say, K distributions and I sample from these K distributions in an independent way and samples, and not necessarily the weight of every distribution is exactly 1 over K, but with some weights, as you said, under which assumptions on the distributions and on K, I actually can I can find K and I can find the distributions. I mean, I know it's not well-defined questions, but maybe, I don't know, for instance, for Gaussians, it has been investigated, and thanks.
Yeah, so this is actually an open problem. It was proved that some of the priors were not consistent. It means that you can't estimate the number of clusters or the number of components with an effect. For example, Dirichlet process. So the main results in terms of consistency are on this case of overfitted mixtures. So where you fix the number of components and then you want some of the weights to be equal to 0. So there are some results showing that. So there are some, so it has to be a continuous model. So there has to be continuous components. There has to be a possibility of identifiability. So it means that it has to be possible to allocate observations to each component. In those cases, like in the case of overfitted mixture, you have consistency. And we used that type of results to prove our result, that like some bounds on this, some like distribution that was dominating our distribution. On the other hand, in the case of finite mixture model with an unknown number of components, so we put a prior on that, there is no result showing consistency. And actually there are results showing that if the components are misspecified, so if you use a Gaussian instead of a T or a Gumbel, so Gaussian components instead of T, Gumbels or whatever, there is like, it's impossible to estimate consistently the number of clusters, which makes sense because like, for example, a Gaussian has thin tails, so you will have more and more clusters on the tails, for example, if you have an asymmetric or a thicker tail observation. So yeah, it's still an open problem. I received a question on, so if you fix, correct me if I haven't understood well, if you fix the number of components, so you estimated the number of components in a similar way, then the allocation is the same or not. So this is another additional problem. So it's not necessarily the same. What you have is that if you use a decision theoretic approach to pick the allocations, that means define a loss function on the allocations. So for example, you penalize the fact that 2 observations should be clustered together, but they're not, or the opposite, they shouldn't be clustered together, but they are. So you use a loss function like that, and then you find the mode of the distribution, or like the model allocation with respect to this loss function. Then you may have similar results if you estimate the similar number of clusters, but it depends also. So for example, in this case, you have a full distribution of the number of clusters. It means that a posteriori, you will have different partitions with different number of clusters. And so like the type of allocation is, so the allocation is, has two forms of uncertainty. So for example, here, I would, I mean, it's not just as simple as I'm estimating these as 4 and these are 3. Most of them are allocated at the same way. But if you use the same loss function to allocate the observations, then most of them will be allocated similarly if you estimate if the posterior distribution is similar. So the question is, can you choose the number of clusters 3? Because in this the model is at 3, and then do k-means after. I mean, you can, but it's not how I would do it. I guess the point of this is to have the full uncertainty in the allocations. So it means that you're not so sure of the number of clusters or the number of components. And so you have a full distribution on that. And then you transfer this uncertainty in the allocation step as well. And it means that there will be some uncertainty in the allocation of observation 1 to a specific cluster. And then there may be an additional uncertainty on the number of clusters. So it helps in introducing more uncertainty to understand if an observation is correctly clustered together with another, or it's more uncertain. So I think it's more a way to understand what is the uncertainty of your allocation than to have a final answer on the correct allocation of that observation. Thank you. Thank you very much.